Hello everyone, today I'll tell you how I built walls from aerated concrete blocks using foam with my own hands for my future house. I'll leave timestamps for each stage of the work in the description. So, let's start from the beginning. What kind of aerated concrete block did I buy? I looked for H+ aerated concrete blocks since reviews said they offered the best value. As I found out during my search, not long ago the H+ factories were bought by the LSR company, so all the pallets I have are labeled LSR. I bought D300 wall blocks with a thickness of 300 mm D400U blocks and D500 partition blocks based on the price. I'll break everything down in detail at the end. As for the delivery of aerated concrete blocks, they were delivered directly from the factory near St. Petersburg, about 150 kilometers away. The total volume was 24 pallets. At the very beginning I made a cut-off waterproofing layer using TECHNONIKOL for a tight connection and laid it on mortar. Then I installed 4 corner blocks, stretched strings between them to control the plane, and set up a laser level. I laid the masonry on cement sand mortar and used adhesive for vertical joints, but if I did it again, I'd use foam instead. The first row of block masonry must be reinforced. I cut 2 grooves along the wall perimeter with a homemade wall chaser, filled them with adhesive for aerated concrete blocks, and placed rebar inside. Next I could lay the second row of blocks. I planned to use adhesive foam for most of the masonry, but needed a perfectly flat surface first. That's why it's practical to lay the row that comes right after the reinforced row using regular mineral adhesive, since the grooves from the reinforcement are often uneven and it's too labor intensive to grind them down. It's best to remove all steps, even with adhesive, since block sizes can vary by +1 mm, causing steps up to 2 mm. I leveled the steps when laying the aerated concrete blocks using this kind of groove planer. It evens things out very quickly and very well. On the contrary, you shouldn't overdo it, because in one spot I ended up with a dip. I just went over it a couple of times and instead of a bump I got a hole there. You can shave down a bump, but filling in a hole is already a problem, so you really shouldn't overdo it. The price tag is still on it. 875 rubles for this. In my opinion, that's a ripoff. I don't have the materials to make it myself, so I had to buy it. I was only able to achieve a perfectly level first row in some places. Where there were imperfections, I fixed them with a rasp, and the second row, laid with glue, also helped with that. The 2 1/8 of an inch glue seam was thick enough to let me level the surface when laying the blocks. I used Rakovsky glue, needing about 1 bag per cubic meter. I mixed the glue in a bucket with a shovel and applied it using a 6 mm notched 28 cm wide trowel. This was convenient for me since I didn't need to cover the whole 30 cm surface. I filled the second row's vertical joints with foam, but usually you don't need to fill them at all. They don't contribute to the load-bearing capacity of the masonry, and our only task is to reduce heat loss and drafts, which can be done in different ways. I was building the walls myself, as I did most things on the house. For the first time I was afraid I'd mess up because I had no experience. Laying aerated concrete blocks with adhesive was surprisingly easy. The most difficult part is laying the first row, because the quality of the first row determines the quality of all the other rows. So it took me 7 days to lay the first row, but I managed to lay the second row in just 5 hours. If the first row's surface is level, you can simply place the next block without any adjustments. I began laying the third row with foam. Initially I tried to find special foam for laying aerated concrete blocks from the same company as the H+H blocks, but even in St. Petersburg it was difficult. In the end I found Titan foam on sale for about 450 rubles per can. The main requirement is that the foam must be labeled for use on exterior walls made of aerated concrete blocks, not just any aerated concrete blocks. Foam use is about 1 can per 1 cubic meter of masonry, so is it better to lay aerated concrete blocks with foam or adhesive? I thought that laying blocks with foam would be much easier than with adhesive, and in terms of time, I was both right and wrong. I did the foam masonry a bit faster. I completed 1 row of masonry with adhesive in 5 hours and 1 with foam and sanding in 4 hours. Laying with foam was less tiring since I didn't have to mix and carry a heavy adhesive bucket. I really don't like wet processes, and working with foam was psychologically easier for me. At the same time I got about equally dirty, but the problem is that foam doesn't wash off. And even after several months I still have some t-shirts with mounting foam on them, and it's also very painful to peel mounting foam off your eyelashes. What are the main advantages and disadvantages I found for myself when laying with foam? Personally, laying with foam is more convenient and a bit faster for me. This difference will be most noticeable on the top masonry rows. The joint when laying with foam, simply put, turns out to be warmer. The foam joint is not zero, and laying with foam is more elastic. What does this give you? Some effects on the house happen constantly, for example thermal expansion or contraction, and masonry with foam, again, simply put, can compensate for this expansion or contraction. That is, there is a certain range in which it can move and the blocks won't crack. Here are the disadvantages of masonry with foam and the advantages of masonry with adhesive. If you don't remove dust and apply low foam correctly, the blocks won't stick or bond together. Secondly, when laying with foam, you need to pay much more attention to leveling the surface. You must completely avoid uneven horizontal joints. When laying with adhesive, it's also better to avoid uneven joints, but this is less critical because the adhesive joint is 1/8 of an inch thick. It's much easier to do this. It's better not to do it like this. Here you can see that half of the block is almost without a joint, and on the other half of the block the joint is already thick. And with a high probability the block might crack here, although there might not be a crack. It's not guaranteed, but it's better not to do it this way. That is, almost all the joints in my house are done like this. First, they are thin, and second, they are even. I have only a few blocks like this in the whole house. So, in the end, whether you use foam or glue, you can make mistakes both when laying with foam and when laying with glue, but when laying with glue, the chances of making a mistake are lower. So, if you have clumsy, irresponsible workers, it's better for them to lay blocks with glue. But if I were to do the masonry a second time, I would still use foam again. Let's get back to the third row. The third row of masonry was the windowsill row for me, so it also needed to be reinforced. Reinforcing the windowsill row, it doesn't necessarily have to be the third row, it just needs to be the windowsill row. Reinforcing this row is necessary. Because in places like this, stress concentration occurs, since the entire mass of the masonry presses on one spot, and without reinforcement, there's a high chance of getting a crack that will go like this. I miscalculated the rebar for the driveway, so there wasn't enough left to reinforce the walls. And once again, the station wagon comes to the rescue. Bringing 3-meter long rebar is no problem at all. I also have experience transporting 3-meter wooden beams inside the cabin with the trunk closed. So it was lying diagonally from this corner of the windshield to the opposite corner of the trunk lid, and it was exactly 3 meters to the millimeter. You could fit 3-meter beams and close the trunk. I reinforced this row the same as the first. Made two 25 by 25 millimeter grooves 5 centimeters from the edge, filled them with aerated concrete adhesive, pressed in 8 mm rebar and leveled the surface with a spatula. This time I only reinforced the windowsill areas, with rebar extending 1 meter on each side of the opening, not the whole wall perimeter. Regarding reinforcement of aerated concrete walls, it is also recommended to reinforce solid wall sections longer than 6 meters every 4 rows, since large wall sections develop stress concentrations due to the same thermal expansion. Reinforcing short wall sections like these doesn't make sense. I have only one solid wall longer than 6 meters, and since my house is small and I used foam for the masonry, I decided not to reinforce this wall. Reinforcing the windowsill row is also recommended. Honestly, I don't know why, and I'll explain my situation. When it became inconvenient to do the masonry from the foundation, I first started putting pallets from the aerated concrete blocks underneath, and then I made steps out of the blocks themselves. After laying 1.5 meters of the wall, the work slowed down. Because first of all I ran out of blocks on the slab, and I had to carry them basically from outside, and I also had to lift the blocks. I didn't bother with scaffolding, I just placed a few blocks, at first one at a time, then a block on a pallet, then 2 blocks, and climbed up like on steps. It's pretty convenient, but by the time you lift and arrange all the blocks you're already tired, so working together would be much faster. If one person on one side of the house did the prep work, sanding everything, sweeping and distributing the blocks at that moment, meanwhile someone else handled the masonry, then they'd switch, allowing the house to be built in a week. The masonry itself goes very quickly, but the preparation takes a lot of time. When the masonry got even higher, I built scaffolding from the foundation using pallets from the gas blocks and panels from the exterior formwork. It's best to build the scaffolding as soon as you need it, since you'll have to do it later otherwise. If you do it the way I made steps out of gas blocks, you'll have to move the gas blocks from place to place and then stack them in a pile. The extra work was that laying with foam went pretty quickly. I did 1 row a day, but I could have done 2 rows if I dedicated all my time to construction. There aren't any special tricks when laying the main wall mass with foam. You just level the surface of the previous row with a float and make sure it's well dusted off. I mopped the masonry and blocks and sprayed them with water. Then we apply foam and set the next block. We have a few seconds to place the block perfectly. I checked the position of the block using a regular level, aligning all the walls along the inner surface, moving the block where it was needed. I tapped with my hands, and by day's end my palms were badly bruised, but it was necessary even with the lightest mallet blows. The D300 aerated block dents very easily, so I used the mallet as little as possible. Honestly, if I were building for the second time, I wouldn't choose the D300 aerated block. Despite its huge advantage in lower heat loss, I would go for the D500. The D300 is just too fragile. In places where there were a lot of whole blocks in the masonry, and to ensure proper bonding, I cut a piece of block to the required size using a regular handsaw for wood. Then, using a cut pipe, I made 2 grooves on each side, big enough to fit the gun in, and fill them with foam. That way, you get a warm and airtight joint in that spot. I also filled with foam the cavities that were made for hand grips. Moving on, I faced the question of how to cover the openings. A door opening 1 meter wide basically doesn't need a lintel, so I just made a support out of boards and placed 2 blocks with a vertical seam on foam. If my floor slab rested properly on the reinforced belt, then basically I wouldn't need any lintels at all because the reinforced belt itself would serve that purpose. In my case, to create an attic floor, everything will be done in a clever way, and the reinforced belt will be above the floor slab, so the slab needs something to rest on. The simplest choice is ready-made reinforced aerated concrete lintels with aerated blocks. They brought me such lintels for 2 window openings, for all the openings. I didn't order them right away because initially an attic floor wasn't planned. And for openings of 1250 mm it would also be possible to do without lintels, but for my panoramic window with an opening of almost 3 meters, there are simply no ready-made lintels available. How are the ready-made aerated concrete lintels installed? My large window openings are about 1.7 meters, and I ordered lintels with a length of 2.25 meters for them. To ensure the required bearing depth, I ordered 2 lintels per opening with a thickness of 150 mm since my wall thickness is 300 mm. Actually, this was a mistake. Ordering one 100 mm and one 200 mm lintel would have been better, since the floor slab only rests on 1 lintel. More load. Reinforced aerated concrete lintels are light, so the two of us carried them easily. Thanks, Dima. I sanded the bearing surface with sandpaper. You can check in advance which side to place the lintel on. There's an arrow drawn on the end, and the arrow should point down. I applied foam and we installed the lintel. The process is quick, so you can install all the lintels in a large house in half a day. For a 3-meter span, the lintel must be monolithic reinforced concrete, and the floor beams will rest on the aerated concrete block wall. D300 is not a very good idea. Actually, everything would hold up, but over time the block could wear down, and I wanted to make everything more reliable. The decision was made to pour from the start of the opening up to the already installed aerated concrete lintel, not just the lintel itself. And on the other wall with small window openings, the back contour goes from corner to corner in U-blocks, thus covering the window openings and creating a reliable platform for supporting the floor slab and for laying U-blocks in the window openings. I made supports out of boards using regular 1-inch planks for the supports. As it turned out, even on an opening just over 1 meter wide, it already sags, so I just added more vertical supports. Next, I set U-blocks on the boards and secured them with foam as before. I had the idea to try cutting the U-blocks myself, but after thinking it over it seemed impractical. It's very labor intensive, plus some blocks are bound to crack in the process and it's not really cost effective, so I just brought the missing U-blocks with my Ford. I made the reinforcement frame for the 3-meter span lintel using the same principle as the frame for my foundation. There are detailed videos about this on the channel, you can check them out too. For the lintel I used 5 12mm rebars. 3 at the bottom and 2 at the top. I bent the transverse clamps with a pipe and number 8 rebar on the same wooden jig, then tied everything together. For the opposite wall I made several frames, which I installed with an overlap. First of all, it made them easier to lift up, because doing this alone is not an easy task, and secondly, I happen to have the right cutoffs. This wall has 12 rebar pieces and each frame had 4 rods. I installed the frames on foam board pads to create a 3 cm protective concrete layer. Next, all of this needed to be filled with concrete, totaling just half a cubic meter. And I seriously considered mixing everything by hand in a bucket, since I don't have a concrete mixer, but when pouring concrete it's very important to avoid something called a cold joint. That means it's best to pour the structure all at once, plus homemade concrete is often far from meeting the standards anyway. All this made me think for a couple of days, during which I finally found a concrete mixer. Seryoga, accept my thanks, you brought the concrete mixer. As the main component of the concrete mix, I bought ready-made CPS M300. This way, the concrete will be of better quality than if you use cement and sand separately, which also preferably need to be sifted as a coarse aggregate. I saw 510 granite crushed stone in 40 kg bags at the store. I brought everything again with the Ford, making sure to get a 4:2:1 mix of crushed stone, sand and cement. I added water using a builder's most precise tool, my eye. In fact, the amount of water will differ from batch to batch even with the same ingredients. I found it easier to measure water with bottles and aimed to match the consistency of what they delivered with the foundation mixer. Working alone, I made small batches, and I had to lift all of this up and still have time to tamp it well to get rid of air bubbles. I poured one wall in half a workday. After pouring, I covered everything with plastic to protect the concrete as it gained strength. At this point, a major stage of the work was completed, and I'll sum up the expenses. All the aerated concrete blocks, lintels, reinforced concrete, and all masonry materials for the walls, gables, and partitions cost me $213,000. All wall finishing materials have been bought, so there won't be future costs for that. All expenses from buying the land until now have exceeded $967,000. Next, I'll cover the floor slab, reinforced belt, and roof in upcoming videos. So subscribe to the channel so you don't miss it, and support me by leaving a comment under the video. It really helps. Thank you for watching. See you next time.